This is the Chi Codes Podcast with your host, Thomas Dockstader.
So, Steve, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm happy to have you. I understand, you're Jeff's dad. I've had Jeff on. Great guy. He had nothing but great things to say about you. And I think, looking at some of the information about you, it's very inspiring, quite frankly. You've spent a lot of your time in your life helping other people. And, for me, I spent a lot of time in my early life complaining why my life was the way it was. And it wasn't until I started to take some accountability and start to focus on how I could value myself. It was then that I started this, I had this passion to start helping other people. And so I'm happy you've come on the podcast today because I think a lot of the stuff that I know about you and your message really rings true to the message I'm trying to send out to the audience. So first, I'd love for you to just kind of explain a little bit about yourself, and then we can kind of dive into a couple of cool things you have coming, like a book. And I know that you focus heavily on storytelling and things like that to get messages across. So I'd love to dive into that.
Okay. Well, I grew up on a small potato farm in Idaho. Okay. And years later, I was a mission president. I used to ask my missionaries, what do you think I learned on that farm? And they said, well, you learned hard work and honesty. And I say, yeah, I did, but mostly I learned I wanted off that farm. And I did. And I was very fortunate to have been able to live and traveled around the world and done humanitarian work and business work in many places and gotten to know people of all kinds of religions and cultures and beliefs. And that's an opportunity that I wish more people had, because it just opens up your view of life and people and differences and lack of differences. And so I've been very, very grateful for that. I finished school, consulted in the U.S. for a while, mm-hmm. and then spent about 30 years doing humanitarian work, primarily in different parts of Africa, fighting AIDS, the HIV/AIDS pandemic over there.
What was interesting for you about Africa specifically? Like what got you going in that direction?
How's a potato farmer from Idaho?
You're like, how can I get as far away from this potato farm as possible?
Well, you know what it was is when I was a kid, they didn't find out that I couldn't see until I was in the 6th grade. I didn't know there were mountains around.
Oh, wow.
I couldn't read the blackboard. I couldn't play sports because until the ball hit me, I didn't know what was coming, but I could read. Mm. And so I read voraciously. And one of the things I read in probably first to middle school was about Dr. Schweitzer and setting up his operation in Africa. And for whatever reason, I was just enamored with that. Mm. And I didn't sit down and say, well, I'm going to do that, or here's a spot. But I think when you have a dream like that, or a vision, you kind of see opportunities that you might not otherwise see. Mm-hmm. And then if you take those, it leads you closer and closer. So, that's probably part of what led me into international work, part of led me into doing humanitarian work generally. And we specifically got to Africa because I had been traveling there on some humanitarian things and came home and went to a meeting with my wife. And it turned out it was a meeting to try to entice people to go on missions.
Okay.
And so in the middle of it, I turned to my wife and said, we can't do that with 6 dependent children, but who cares? Want to go to Africa and see if we can make a difference with AIDS? And she said, let's go. And 5 months later, we were living in Harare, Zimbabwe.
Oh, wow.
And I was going around the country trying to see what was going on because it was still illegal to talk about it publicly then.
When was this?
1969, I guess.
That's when you went to Africa?
It would have been later than that, 79. Because at the time, Zimbabwe had the highest AIDS rate in the world. about 38% of all adults were HIV positive. That meant they were dead in about 5 years.
And this was in the 70s?
Yeah, the 70s,
Late
80s.
70s, 80s. Okay.
Then when they first kind of discovered.
Yeah.
There were no treatments, there were no cures, there was no teaching going on about it, and a lot of those dying were kids.
Mm.
And the country didn't want to admit that there was anybody with AIDS, but gradually that started to change, and we developed a program to help middle school, high school kids avoid getting the disease.
Okay.
And that kind of spread through Zimbabwe and then a big chunk of Southern Africa.
So you were involved in fighting AIDS really early on.
Really early on.
Wow, that's incredible.
In fact, before we went, I happened to know a guy who was the head of the General Hospital in San Francisco, which is where AIDS was exploding here, and talked to him for quite a bit. And the counsel he gave me was really of great benefit when I got to Zimbabwe, and nobody would talk at all.
Interesting.
I could go to some places like USAID, and they would help me. They would talk about what was going on, what wasn't going on, and there was a group of Catholic sisters who ran a place called Mashambanzo, and they were taking care of, either literally when it was babies, or providing food and education for about 3,000 AIDS orphans in the Harare area.
My gosh.
And they had some programs that didn't work very well, so I worked with them, and then it was a matter of fighting with the government to let us do it, and then finally get it adopted. And but yeah, it was just kind of it grew out of an interest. And,
Okay.
and I've probably been on 20 safaris on different kinds, and so I love Africa.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, I think that's an area of the world that many don't get to, really explore, right?
Nobody would even come see us when we were over there because they were afraid they were going to get killed.
Well, yeah, in the 80s, it was nobody knew anything about it really, right? And it was a very, very scary time.
They were scared of Africa and they were scared of AIDS.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and you weren't, obviously.
Africa's no more dangerous than any other place, and AIDS isn't something that you catch through the air, but we didn't know that then. Yeah,
exactly. Wow, that's pretty impressive. So you went and lived in Africa. Talk to me a little bit about, when did you leave? When did you come back? How did you progress in your philanthropy and, really just helping other people?
Well, I had been involved in a program with a organization I helped start in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, what they primarily did was, things that start with C, cataracts, cleft lips, cleft palates, things with a simple operation, you could change people's lives.
Yeah.
And we were doing a lot of cataracts in Zimbabwe. Mm-hmm. And but the foundation wasn't interested in trying to get involved with AIDS. That was too complicated. Mm-hmm. So I knew some people over there, and we just went, not really knowing what we were going to do. And the whole family was there for about 3 years. Things were starting to get a little dicey we were running, 1,000% inflation a week in some cases. AIDS was out of control. Were taking all the farms, so a country that used to export food to the rest of Southern Africa was suddenly destitute and had no food. Wow. And so there were starting to be some riots and discontent. And so the family went home, and I commuted for quite a while, 6 months in Meridian, Idaho, or 6 weeks, and then 6 weeks back in Africa. It's a long commute.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it also taught me a lot of things, doing that. I had mentioned being out on a safari, and I had gone back once and forgot it was a holiday time over there. Can't get anything done holiday time. So I just went on a little safari out not too far from the city, and I'm sitting in the tent. Outside the tent, this little wood fold-up table with my laptop. typing away on something, and all of a sudden this gigantic elephant walks by about 40 feet in front of me.
Oh, my gosh.
I look at the elephant, I'm looking at my computer, and I just started laughing. What else can you do?
Yeah.
The juxtaposition of the two.
Oh, my gosh.
But I got a real feel for Africa, and if it weren't so far away from family, I'd go back in a minute.
Interesting.
And have been back many, many times.
So, I mean, I know Africa is huge, right? The continent itself.
Yeah.
But, like, where did you spend the majority of your time?
I was mostly in southeastern Africa, which is where most of the AIDS was.
Southeastern Africa.
So that's, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Uganda, South Africa, on over to Namibia, Angola, all that part of Africa.
Okay.
We went back another time, this is probably 10 years later, and spent 6 months in Ghana developing self-reliance courses to teach people how to start businesses and manage their finances so they could try to get ahead a little bit.
I think I need that.
Yeah, me too. And they later brought that program to the U.S., so it's available. But, I don't know. I kind of took every opportunity. We had come home from AIDS, and I had a friend who knew something about what was going on in Rwanda when they had the massacres there. And that's a French-speaking country. He spoke French, but he'd never been to Africa. So he got a hold of me somehow, and off we went. I always say yes. And so we go to Uganda, and we have this truck full of medical supplies that we were trying to get in. And normally you would get stopped at every city for 2 or 3 days, waiting in big lines and filling out permits. But we happened to know a guy in government who gave us a permit. And so we were going through and city by city, and I learned a couple of interesting lessons on that. One is at the beginning, as you entered or exited every city, there would be guards.
Okay.
Typically 16, 18-year-olds with Kalashnikovs. And I had seen that all over the world. I wasn't concerned about that. But I would look in these kids' eyes, and they were just vacant.
Oh, man.
And then I would remember they had watched, probably participated in, the slaughter, mostly by machete, of 700,000 people. You say, how does a kid recover from that? But most of them do.
Wow.
They find a way to move forward. I think it's
human resilience is pretty incredible, isn't it?
Humans are incredible.
Yeah.
To do that and find a way forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty wild. One thing that kind of comes to mind as you're telling me this, I think about the way that we behave, right, in life. And, I think that I teach this and I talk about it, but I think that we all have this inner voice, right? This intuition, or whatever you can call it, whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
But we all heard it. We all know it. And I think that a lot of times most people don't actually trust themselves that much. So they ignore that voice.
Yeah.
A lot of the time. And we always say, oh man, I knew it. I had a gut feeling I should have listened to myself. How many times have we said that? It seems to me you have a very clear avenue and communication with that intuition, that making these huge life decisions that you feel, empowered or connected in knowing. There's like this knowing that you're like, it's going to be okay. It's going to work. I want to do this. Right. And in turn, you end up living this incredible life that a lot of us maybe don't, because we don't listen.
Well, it's usually a lot clearer in retrospect than it
2020 is always
it is at the moment. Yeah. But I suspect one thing is I have been willing to take risk or just go out. We, my son Jeff, and Jeff's black, and I'll tell you a story about his brother, but when we first got married, we thought, wouldn't it be great to have a multicultural family? we were already in our 30s, but we got busy and had kids and forgot about it. And we moved back to Idaho, and our youngest was 6. And my wife came home one day and said, you know what? I know how we could do that now. You still go for it? Okay. And so we started the adoption process and first found out we were too old for any Asian adoptions. And
why?
They use a formula because they're looking at the lifespan over there and say they're already in their 40s. They're not going to live long enough to raise this child.
Okay.
So you're eliminated there. We're eliminated for most newborns because there were some younger families looking for them. And then she said, would you consider a hardship adoption? I said, what does that mean? She said, well, we have right now a lot of black babies and no place to put them. I said, we don't care what color they are. A kid's a kid.
Yeah.
And so we started the process, and we looked around and said, boy, there aren't many black people here in Idaho. Maybe we ought to go for 2. And they said, no, you can't do that. And we appealed that, and they said, no, you can't do that. So, and here, I don't know if this is following your intuition, like you mentioned, or as arrogance, but we went out and bought a double stroller and 2 cribs.
Well, I think it is because
arrogance. And sure enough, we finally got all that done. We got a call from a place in Atlanta. They said, we got a little boy here for you. He said, great, we'll take him. The very next day, we got a call from an agency in Washington, D.C. said, we got a little boy here for you. And I said, look, here's the problem. We would love to. Now you have 3-4 different agencies all having to agree on this. And it's against all their policies. They finally agreed. And so 2 weeks later, my wife went to Washington and picked up Jeff, who you know. And a week later, I went to Atlanta and picked up his brother, Hunter. And it turns out they were born about 3 hours apart from each other.
Wow.
But in different parts of the country.
Incredible.
And so we just look at that as supposed to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You take a little risk, you're a little adventurous, but great things happen.
I think it looks risky because we compare it to what we see as quote unquote normal. But to my point, I think there's this inner guide that says, no, this is what you're supposed to do, because you following that intuition drastically changed those boys' lives.
Yes.
Drastically. Just one small decision, right? I mean, it's a big decision, but I'm just saying you guys pushing for it and putting it in there, putting it out there and having that intuition to follow through, buying the cribs. Like that's in my mind, you're creating. You are creating. And you are creating a place for those boys to be, which changed their lives incredibly.
Changed theirs and our other children and us.
Yeah, everybody benefited from it, right?
Changes everything.
Yeah. That's amazing.
In fact, one of the things, I used to do a lot of youth leadership camps when we were living in Idaho. And, you'd take them up and one of the things I was always trying to teach, to get across, was dream dreams. And so I would start talking about it, and I always have a flip chart with a marker and say, okay, write your dreams. Well, the first thing they put up is all the things that they knew their parents wanted them to put up. I want to go to college.
Right.
I want to do this.
Yeah.
I said, no. Let's try again. I want to be a little more adventurous. What are some? So they were a little better. I said, no. Let's try once again. I said, maybe one of your dreams is riding a Harley naked across the Sahara Desert. Oh, wow, this guy's serious. He really wants to know what I'm thinking. And then they would start talking. And I'd say, guys, keep those dreams. Work on them. Follow them. Make them happen. You may not complete it the way you think, but every step you make is going to get you closer, and you're going to learn from that. And I think that's an important part of everybody's life, and too often gets beat out of us. Mm-hmm. Or we decide we can't do it, or we don't have the ability, or it's not possible, or I'm too dumb, or something, when we could. We could just follow that dream, and we give them up too soon.
It's so true. I mean, I believe that with all of my heart. An interesting thing, happened to me a couple of years ago, and it was in this process of kind of learning to ultimately listen to myself. To your point, like the biggest, I guess, epiphany I ever had was that I am enough. And I had it to myself. And that was like, what? I am enough? Like, I don't need anyone else to tell me that I'm enough. I can tell myself that. Well, in that same kind of like situation that was happening, I had this, it was, I don't know what you want to call it. It was a breakthrough like nothing I've ever experienced. But I had this thought that me could change the world. And at first when I thought that, I was like, oh, that's the dumbest thought I've ever had. And then it came back and it was like, no, you can change the world. And then it's proceeded to show me how. And it was like, it's just what you're saying. It's literally step by step. And it told me, it was like, because I wrote this book 5 years ago, it told me, it was like, you've already written your book.
And you didn't know all the answers when you started?
I zero. I actually didn't even know why I was writing the book.
But you went.
Followed my intuition, yes. Yeah. And so that's what pushed me to start this podcast and I love that message that you're saying is it's like, you shoot for the stars, you look at this, you have this pinnacle idea. And it doesn't have to be super specific, but you have this idea of what you want. And then you take that step every single day towards that idea. And it might seem insurmountable. And you may say it to someone and they might think you're crazy. You can't do that. But some people have different thoughts about Elon. But the one thing I think about Elon is that guy, the stuff that he's doing is crazy. Building rockets and building electric cars and just I think most people think that's not possible for me, but it's literally possible for everyone. And I love that you're telling your children that.
We just discount ourselves. Mm-hmm. And, little potato farmer from Idaho is going to change the world. Well, I don't know that I changed the world, but I saved some people's lives and I made life different. And it certainly wasn't because I was the smartest or knew more. It's mostly because I tried. I had a great professor at BYU long time ago in graduate school, named of Gene Dalton, and he had us write a paper about ourselves. And it had to be really thorough. We had to take all kinds of psychological tests and personality tests and get interviewed by people and interview other people and write down our biggest concerns and issues and things we wanted to do and put it in this paper. And the way Gene dealt with the class is he would have a one-on-one with you. Not many professors do that. Mm. So I go in there, and he was kind of taken by a sentence I had in there that I said, I'd like to climb Mount Everest. And Gene goes, do you do a lot of climbing? I said, no, I don't do any climbing. He says, well, you must do a lot of outdoor stuff. I said, no, I really don't. And he looked at me and he said, Steve, most people who climb Mount Everest go outside. And I thought about that a lot. Took the summer off and went to Jackson, worked at a Cattle Baron restaurant as a waiter and learned how to climb. Mm-hmm. I never made it to Everest, but I have taught lots of people to climb. I'm teaching grandkids right now to rappel. And but you had to do something. And that's one of the things I tried to teach kids when I'm doing leadership classes is do something. Mm-hmm. Make it, stop what you're not doing and do something. Yeah. It doesn't have to be big. You don't need to save the world. Just move a little closer.
Well, and I think that, I think about this all the time because if you think about some of the most influential people in our world, Steve Jobs, people didn't listen to Steve Jobs when he was starting out. They didn't, you know what I'm saying? Like he wasn't mobbed with interest and people wanting his attention and all these things. Well, how did it start? Bill Gates, he started in a garage. They started in like everything starts somewhere. they don't just enter the arena as this mega, power. There's the reason that I believe that those people became what they did. They were unwavering in their desire to create what they believed in.
Yeah. And they weren't afraid of failing or making mistakes. Look at the rockets that Elon blows up.
They fail all the time. Constantly.
$100 million rockets.
That's my point, is it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. You keep at it.
Right. Exactly. They're unwavering in that. And almost to the point where you see those kind of guys and it's like money and stuff like that. You can tell it's not what's driving them.
Yeah.
It's very clear. In fact, most of them, Steve Jobs wore the same clothes every day. You could tell very clearly he didn't care about the money. It was the mission that he was on. So for me, for you, it's the mission that I'm on, that I want to change people's lives. And if changing someone's life is just inspiring them for one moment, that's a success.
Yeah.
Right?
You don't have to start Tesla or go to Washington. You can change people's lives sometimes just by talking. Mm-hmm. A long, long time ago, when we were still living in Idaho, my wife and I had joined a march for kind of freedom and equality from the train station to the Capitol. We get to the Capitol, and it's dark, it's kind of rainy, it's cold. This is the 1st of December, and they had asked me to give a talk. So I'm standing on the steps of the Capitol, and we've been hearing all kinds of things about what people could do and should do. And I said, let me tell you some of my story, but I'm not asking you to go on a march or to donate $100,000. I'll tell you what I'm asking you for. I'm asking you, when you see a person of color or a person of a different religion, go over and say hi. Mm. That's all you need to do. Mm-hmm. But if we all did that, all the rest of the stuff would go away.
Yeah, it changes everything.
Because now it's human to human.
Exactly.
And so we can make a big difference with just a little tiny thing.
Yeah, it's. I like to think about it as like it is this ripple effect, where even a small pebble thrown in a pond, it affects the entire thing. And so it's like these small things that we do affect humanity in such a powerful way. Because I saw this YouTube video once where it's explaining the psychology of a movement that happens. And it shows this guy dancing at this concert, and he's dancing crazy, and everybody's just watching him and no one's paying attention to him. And he's in this big open space that no one's around. And eventually one person gets up and starts doing the same thing. And what it shows is the psychology is that he starts to mimic that main person, but then the people who come to do it with him start mimicking the follower. And so what it explains is it's like, if you want to start a movement, you actually only have to change one person, because people start to follow that person, and then it starts to have this chain reaction. So if you're trying to make these big changes and impact lots of lives, you only need to impact one to make a massive effect across.
And you never know where that's going to be.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite authors, I can't remember his name right now. He's a psychologist, and he wrote books like Young Man Luther and Gandhi's Truth. And what he wrote about was their greatest contribution came from what they perceived to be their greatest weaknesses. Mm. But they worked on overcoming that and ended up doing incredible things in the area that they felt they had no ability at all. And you look at Gandhi. I mean, he's not a very handsome man. Little shriveled guy, and kind of weird. Really weird, actually, when you get down to it. And what did he do? He didn't write a great big book, but he joined a march with the people who admired him to the sea to open up salt so people could get it. And it changed India. Mm. And, you have examples like that all over. And sometimes I think people say, I've got to have this great skill and I don't have it. Mm-hmm. No, you don't. Sometimes it's that weakness that grows. My not being able to see until I was in 6th grade. That was a weakness. It caused me a lot of problems but also created the rest of my life.
It's a catalyst for something else, right? It's a catalyst that leads you for something else. So talk to me a little bit about the book you have coming. What inspired that and what's it about?
The book is called Stories That Shape Us. And it's a guide to using stories to tell, to pass on wisdom and experience and love to the next generation. And like most things, it didn't just appear. Mm-hmm. It grew out of things. And the first thing I remember is when Jeff and his brother were about 9, we were packing up to move to Africa. And he came across some pictures in a file of me with President Ford and with President Reagan. Mm. He said, "What's this? Is this Photoshop?"
Yeah.
And I realized I had never talked to them about the time I spent at the White House or the things I had done there. Years later, my wife asked me to write a kind of history of myself, which I did, which nobody was interested in. And then but I was talking to one of my grandsons and was telling them about how his uncles, these 2 youngest boys, used to be sometimes followed home from school because of their skin color. Mm. And he looks at me, this 7-year-old goes, "Why? That's dumb." And then that turned into a whole discussion of prejudice. And, it's not easy you wouldn't sit down with a 7-year-old and say, "Well, we're going to talk about discrimination and prejudice."
Right.
How do you explain that?
Yeah.
But he was captivated. And the next day brought it up with his family. And we had this long discussion. I thought, you know what? We don't do that enough. We don't talk to our children and grandchildren. We've kind of relegated that to the internet or social media. And you can get lots of data from that, but you don't always get the context or the love or the caring. Now, we used to do that. I mean, from the cave paintings in France, trying to teach the next generation about the hunt and the hunters and the risk, because it was their lives depended on it. And we've had storytellers in tribes everywhere throughout history. But to some degree, we've lost that a little bit in our modern society.
Why do you think that is? What do you think? Why do you think we've lost that?
Well, we get busy. Mm-hmm. We have so many instruments and tools like the internet, like social media. We get carried away with things. Everybody's busy. And so when we do talk to kids or grandkids, we talk about the weather, the sports teams, and we kind of don't know how to get into a serious discussion. Mm. And so I first started writing the book, say, well, look, why don't you identify your own traits that you think are important and beliefs and principles, and then use stories from your own life to illustrate those, so you could be telling a story that would lead to a discussion. And then I began to think, I bet there's a lot of other people who would like to be able to share their lives, their values with children and grandchildren, but they don't know how. Mm-hmm. So it kind of turned more into here's how you can do this.
So it's a how-to book on how to tell your story. I love you're saying this because oftentimes I'll invite people on the podcast and they'll say to me, "I don't have anything interesting to talk about. I'm not interesting." I'm like, "Yes, you are. Trust me." Yeah. And every single person I bring on, they're interesting. They have a lot of stuff to talk about. And to your point, I think it gets lost. So here's an example. My dad died 20 years ago. I was 22 and he was 53. Think about that time. He was born in 52. He died in 2005. There was no smartphones when he died. So everybody didn't have a camera in their pocket and we were taking videos all the time. So we literally only have like 2 family videos of my dad, and that is it. Yeah. He didn't write anything. Yeah. There's no writing. There's a couple pictures. We have some pictures and we have a little bit of video. And he was a very quiet guy. He did not share with us his childhood very much or anything like that. I thought about that a lot. So I wrote this book 5 years ago. It's a story of my life, and I wrote it specifically for my son. But what's even more powerful is a couple of months ago, I had my mom on, and we went through her whole life. Well, she just passed away. And I didn't think about that at the time. Yeah. I didn't think about her telling her life and then her passing away. But now we have this video of her sitting down and talking about her life that I can go and revisit at any time.
Yeah.
How valuable is that I can give that to my son? He can show it to his kids. Like, we have this record of their grandmother that they can go and look at. And then it makes me realize how powerful it is that you can share that, because while that person themselves might not think it's so important, it is to so many people. And I think about the amount of content I put out and the stuff like that. And I think about my son's capability. He's only 13 now, but he has the ability to go and reference that maybe when he's older, when he actually starts to take interest.
Yeah, exactly. I have the same thing. People say, well, my life's boring. And let's say he's a dishwasher over at the breakfast restaurant. And I said, well, what happened today? Well, this happened. That's a story. Yeah. What did you learn from that? And then I try to get some people then tell me some incredible stories. I said, do you have that written down anywhere? Have you shared that with anybody? I said, you may have a great-great-grandson who you will never know, who's struggling with life, who feels isolated, doesn't feel like he's part of everything, has some decisions he doesn't want to make. And he might be reading something from you that would change his life. Not only on what you say, but this is my great-grandfather. I'm part of that. He left this for me. He did this. I can do it too. But if you don't, he'll never hear it.
Yeah.
We all are going to make our own mistakes, but we don't need to make all of them all by ourselves.
No kidding. Yeah, you're 100% right. And man, how much would I love right now to be able to go and access, even if my dad wrote a book about his life, oh my gosh, I would just love it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, at 22, maybe I wasn't very interested, right? But now, oh my gosh, I so am. And so one thing I encourage, I'm like, everybody should write a book. They don't have to go and release it to the world, but you should write a book about your life. It's interesting. People care. Just because I know about my childhood doesn't mean my son's going to know about it, right? Like, there's so much I love. Well,
and our lives are so different. I was born in 1948. You know what gasoline cost a gallon in 1948? 19 cents.
Okay. I was just going to say 20 cents.
My dad's first house, a brand new house in Spokane, Washington, was $3,800.
Man, I wish I could get on that.
Don't you wish you could get a monthly payment for it?
Oh, yeah, no kidding.
And, but it's a totally different world. I mean, it may as well, for kids today, it may as well be the Peloponnesian Wars. Yeah. But they grew up and were passing on things they had learned from wars and depression. My generation, as the boomers, grew up where everything was possible. And we went with that. And, we went to the moon and we doubled lifespan and we created all kinds of things. And we made our mistakes too. We left families when we shouldn't have. We paid more attention to work than kids. And now you have a rebellion against that. Mm-hmm. And you always have that. But if you have some of that history, then a kid can kind of put that in perspective a little bit. And that's so important.
Yeah.
The other day, this was a couple of years ago, Black Lives Matter marches were going on. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to all my neighbors saying, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. This is horrible. I'm thinking, where were you in the 60s? We were burning down cities and taking over universities.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, but this has happened before.
This is nothing. But a kid grows up and he doesn't know any of that. He doesn't have any perspective. So the only world he can see is the one he's living in. And he has to try to make all his judgments based on this little narrow piece. And part of passing on stories and passing on that legacy is to help those kids get a different perspective of life, a little broader than just what happened to them at school yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. it's so important to document it. And, that's an interesting thing. I had this, incredible moment happen in my life where I got this ability to look in the mirror, and it happened in an interesting way. But like I was thinking about my dad, and I was thinking about how I wanted his approval and I wanted his attention and all these things. Now he's gone. And then this like epiphany hit me. It's like, you mean like the approval you give your son? And then I was like, oh my gosh, I'm repeating it. I'm doing it again. Right. And so what's interesting is like, when I was growing up, it was like, don't drink, don't have sex, don't do those things. That was basically the extent of what I was told about those things.
You were told no.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
That's it. Well, I became an alcoholic.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's interesting because the way that I talk to my son about it now, because I'm so fearful of him developing a drinking problem or something like that, I overload him with information about it because it doesn't work to just say, don't do that.
Yeah. I
talk to him about how that develops and why it develops and where it leads and what happens. Why did I develop that problem? I was avoiding something. I was avoiding my feelings. I was avoiding this because I didn't understand how to process it. Right. So we have these deep conversations. And I think, to your point, sharing your story is so powerful because it can help people avoid. Like, I wish my father would have told me the things he went through that caused him to be the way that he was, because it may have potentially helped me avoid some of the mishaps that I went through myself. And I think I love that you're encouraging people on how to tell their stories.
Let's talk. Let's have a conversation about something. And stories really are a way to get into that. Mm-hmm. A way to get into it without sounding all stuffy and turning them off.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they really, some of my grandkids, I'd read them bedtime stories at night from the books, and they were good. But then one time my wife didn't have any more books, and she says, well, look, just tell them some stories when you were a kid. So I did. That's all they wanted to hear from then on. I thought, why would they be interested in that? But they wanted to know who I was and what I had done and what their experience. And I think because they could relate to Grandpa more than they could a book, no matter how good the character in the
You're
book
the main
is.
character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just wanted story after story after story.
Yeah.
And some of them were just funny. Some of them, Grandpa looked pretty ridiculous, and because he was. And every now and then it would turn into some kind of a serious discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And
which those are probably the most valuable ones, I think. Yeah, absolutely. It's like, how do you, I think people sharing their own experiences is some of the most interesting stories that you'll have. Not because, again, to your point, it doesn't have to necessarily sway someone one direction or another, but it opens up someone's mind from another perspective. Because again, you grew up in Idaho, potato farm, you went to Africa. Your perspective of the world is entirely different than your neighbors that grew up in Idaho, right? Because you guys had these different experiences, and it's so important to hear both perspectives.
I just got an invitation to a high school reunion.
Oh, wow.
My high school only had about 50 in its graduating class, so it was a very small little high school. And most of them never left town. So their whole experience, not that it wasn't a good experience, they did some wonderful things, but they never left town. If they did, they went to Boise, which is 40 miles away, and that's as far as they went.
To the big city.
And, you can't have the same perspective with that limited of an experience. I'm just fortunate that I was able to have that. Yeah,
absolutely. You make a good point. I remember when I was growing up, and I was like, I'm raised in Utah, and I can't wait to get out of here. I can't wait to get out of this town. And in my early 20s, I started working for a big Hewlett-Packard, and I was traveling all over the United States and all over. And I started to appreciate where I grew up. Because I was like, gosh, Utah's pretty clean. Utah's pretty safe. Utah's pretty this.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh. And to your point, it like shifts your perspective, not to say one place is worse than the other, but you start to understand and realize how diverse the world is, especially when you go overseas. You know, Europe, and like it's just an entirely different universe, really, in the way that people are raised and how they believe and all those things.
You know, and we do that even here. I had spent a lot of time in New York. We had offices there, and I love New York City.
Me too.
I just absolutely love it. And I had a group of friends, and we were mostly older. The kids were mostly gone in Idaho. And they were, you know, doctors and lawyers and things like that. And they'd never been to New York. They were terrified of New York. All they had ever done is watch the movies, you know, Escape from New York or something like that. And so finally I convinced them all, let's go. And they knew there was, you know, then I said, okay, you're getting a New York experience. We're riding the subways. We're not driving taxis.
Oh my gosh.
We get on the subways. Without a time, they would open a map and some New Yorker would be right there. Can I help you? And it was amazing. We had great weather. This was in November. Every single one of them was back to New York within 6 months.
It is a
total different perspective.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. Because I remember the first time I went to New York, I spent a lot of time there, but first time I went to New York, it is an experience. When you're in Manhattan, it's incredible. The buildings and the energy, you can feel the energy.
The energy is wild.
Yeah, I got to take my fiance there for she'd never been there. I took her there last year. It's the same thing. She's like, I can just feel the vibration of this place. It's just like crazy, like everything that's going on.
We would always take our kids when they were kind of early teens to New York and D.C., just so they could experience it a little bit.
It's eye-opening.
And it just changes. Mm-hmm. I mean, even a kid can feel the energy in New York. Mm-hmm. You have to be dead to not. Yes. I think even the dead can feel the energy in New York.
Yeah.
It's
a go all the time.
And it's exciting.
It is. It's very exciting. Great food. Like, you know, to your point, it's just like a great experience to get out of your, you know, for some people, they wouldn't want to live there, but just to go and to visit and experience it. It gives you a new perspective of, and to your point, you know, Hollywood paints it in much different, you know, oh, we can't go on the subways. Everybody's going to be mean and this and that. Yeah. You know, I love the New Yorkers because they're very to the point. They're very, you know where you stand with them. Not necessarily in a rude way, but
it's just how they talk.
Yeah. They're just very blunt and to the point.
You know, it's the same thing with Paris. I had a partner over in Paris, and we just did all kinds of fun things. I remember one time, 1 o'clock in the morning on a moped, riding up and down the Champs-Élysées and going all over the place, having a ball. Mm-hmm. But a lot of Americans just assume that all Parisians are going to be rude to them, mm-hmm. and they're not going to get help. I've never experienced that. I've never experienced that anywhere in the world I've gone. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is what you're looking for.
Yep.
If you're looking for people to dislike you or cause problems, you're going to find it.
Yeah.
If you're warm and welcoming, you're going to find that.
Yeah.
Because that's how people are everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, I think, look, first of all, I think that's the energy you're putting out for yourself, right? Like you're open and kind of going on this adventure and being willing to accept the unknown ultimately, because I think a lot of people get very stuck in that control, you know, mentality of like, I've got to control everything. I've got to know. And when you're more a little bit of a risk taker and say, hey, I'm going to be open, I'm going to be receiving, you open yourself up to that energy and you start to receive it wherever you go.
Life is serendipitous. Things change. You can't stop it. You have to embrace it.
Yeah.
You know, I was, when I was a mission president in South Africa, I took a group of missionaries up to a little town called Ladysmith, about, I don't know, hour and a half, 2 hours west of Durban. And we to go hiking on a preparation day in Drakensberg's Mountain. When we came back, I'd seen before this absolutely exquisite little mosque. And so I said, I want you guys to see this. And so we go by down there. It's across a little stream. There's a bridge. We're looking at this, and there's a knock on the window. And this guy says, would you like to come in? I said, oh, man, well, I'd love to, but, we're all dirty and sweaty. We just got back from. He said, that's okay. Come with me. So there's like 12 of us. We all go in there. He says, now you're going to have to take off your shoes, and I'll ask you to wash your hands. And so we do that. And so he says, just stand back here till we finish our prayers. And so we stood back there, never having experienced that ever. And as soon as their prayers were over, the whole group came back, embraced us, talked to us about how Jesus was one of their great prophets and how we have so much in common and how welcome we were to their mosque, and please come back anytime. And I'm thinking, would we do that? And it was about a year, or it was a little while after that, I had taken this group to New York. And we had dinner in the trade towers, windows on the world on the top. A year from that is when they came down.
Oh, wow.
And one of the great tragedies out of that for me is all of a sudden everybody in the country hated Muslims because they were all wicked, terrible terrorists. I'm going, they're not.
Yeah.
They're not. Most of them are as appalled by this as you are.
Couple bad seeds, spoiled the bunch.
And but we are so quick to judge countries and ethnicities by somebody who does something.
Yeah.
When we'd be aghast if they judged all Americans by my behavior.
Right. Exactly.
Sometimes my behavior is not so great.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's very true. So your book's going to be releasing in April.
Yes.
It'll be
in June.
June. Okay. And it'll be available
on Amazon. We will have it, paperback and ebook and audiobook. So it'll be available however people want to get it. In the meantime, I've never had a social media site.
Jeff will help you with that.
But Jeff is helping me with that. And so he's, that's why I was filming, to put things on there. And so, on Instagram and, all the regular sites, we're keeping the stuff, and we're keeping people abreast of where the book is and when it gets published and where they can find it.
Beautiful. Well, so the name of the book is?
Stories That Shape Us.
Stories That Shape Us.
Yeah. A guide to passing on wisdom, love, caring to the next generations.
Awesome. Well, that's great. So I think we're about going to be at time here, but Stories That Shape Us by Steve Mann, going to be available in June on Amazon and all the other avenues that we can get
it out there.
Awesome. Super excited. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. This has been great fun.
Absolutely. It's been a wonderful time. Wish you the best, and I'll get your book when it comes out.
Terrific.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Well, make sure you do get one.
I will.